In the first part of this lecture, I talked about different versions of truth, different conceptions of truth. Now I'm going to talk about various alternatives to truth. And our guide here is going to be Harry Frankfurt, a philosopher who wrote an article called On Bullshit in the 1980s that actually later, about 20 years later, became a bestseller as a fun kind of talking stuffer book. And I think maybe the most straightforward and useful way to discuss the essay is by talking through the definitions of 4 key terms, which we can hopefully add to our own analytical toolkit for analyzing different forms of untruthfulness. So the key terms here are lies, bullshit, bull sessions, and finally, humbug. Now, Frankfurt is, I think, in part for comedic effect, adopting a kind of classical philosophical approach in the tradition of Aristotle of using examples and logic and interrogation of other thinkers' definitions to pin down the true essence of bullshit. It's one true meaning. And thinking through the distinctions that Frankfurt draws can hopefully be useful to us for analyzing various different cases of falsehood in the real world. But that said, it's important to keep in mind that the Aristotelian approach of thinking of objects like words, right, as cultural objects as having one true essence is kind of retro, right? This is kind of a old school philosophical approach. It's important to keep in mind the slightly more up-to-date insight from Stuart Hall and from cultural studies that different thinkers use the same words in different ways. So I don't want you to kind of get locked into thinking that Frankfurt's definition of lying, for example, is the only definition, or that other thinkers are going to use it in the same way. When Hannah Arendt, whom I'll discuss next, discusses lying, the term in her uses actually seems to encapsulate both what Frankfurt calls lying and what he calls bullshit. In Frankfurt's definition, though, a lie is something very specific and actually maybe something pretty rare in the real world. It's rarely found, at least in kind of pure form. For Frankfurt, lying is the deliberate negation of the truth. And by the way, Frankfurt seems to be relying on the correspondence theory of truth here. So there's something out there in the real world, and the liar knows or thinks they know what the truth is about that thing in the world, but then makes a statement that does not correspond to that truth. Frankfurt writes that lying is actually kind of a niche craft. So he writes, quote, "Telling a lie is an act with sharp focus. It is designed to insert a particular falsehood at a specific point in a set or system of beliefs in order to avoid the consequences of having that point occupied by the truth. This requires a degree of craftsmanship in which the teller of the lie submits to objective constraints imposed by what he takes to be the truth. The liar is inescapably concerned with truth values. In order to invent a lie at all, he must think he knows what is true. And in order to invent an effective lie, he must design his falsehood under the guidance of that truth." So Frankfurt's point is that in the very act of negating the truth, the liar is necessarily very concerned with what the truth really is. The bullshitter, though, doesn't care about the truth one way or the other. So Frankfurt continues, quote, "On the other hand, a person who undertakes to bullshit his way through has much more freedom. His focus is panoramic rather than particular. He does not limit himself to inserting a certain falsehood at a specific point, and thus he is not constrained by the truths surrounding that point or intersecting it. He is prepared to fake the context as well, so far as need requires. This freedom from constraints to which the liar must submit does not necessarily mean, of course, that his task is easier than the task of the liar. But the mode of creativity upon which it relies is less analytical and less deliberative than that which is mobilized in lying. It is more expansive and independent, with more spacious opportunities for improvisation, color, and imaginative play. This is less a matter of craft than of art, hence the notion of the bullshit artist." So a key difference between lying and bullshitting is that bullshitting is not necessarily intentionally false. A statement can correspond to reality and still be bullshit. And this is an important point because, as we'll see, a lot of propaganda, a lot of the most effective propaganda, and a lot of the most insidious misrepresentations in the real world are bullshit, in that they do pick and choose true facts as evidence here or there, mixes them in with falsehoods, but not everything about them is false in the sense of not corresponding to reality. Frankfurt writes, quote, "The essence of bullshit is not that it is false, but that it is phony. Although it is produced without concern with the truth, it need not be false. The bullshitter is faking things, but that does not mean that he necessarily gets them wrong." So Frankfurt thinks that when considering truthfulness, it's important not just to look at the factuality or falsity of a statement, but also at the intentions and the disposition of the speaker. And what's going to become a recurring theme for this lecture series, we have to think not only about the inherent characteristics of a cultural object, and a claim about the world is one kind of cultural objects, right? Truthfulness, like meaning, isn't contained within the object itself, but at least partially produced through the social interactions in which that object is used. It isn't enough for a fact to be accurate. That fact has to be used in a truthful way in social interaction or in political debate. So, for example, let's say I'm a journalist and for whatever reason, I really want to get my readers whipped up about the threat of undocumented immigrants to their communities. If I painstakingly research crime rates, compile thousands of police reports, and then falsify data, fudge the numbers to claim that undocumented immigrants commit violent crimes at extremely high rates when they don't, as far as I can tell, they don't, that would make me a liar. I take the time to learn the truth just to violate it. But on the other hand, and probably more realistically, if I as a journalist simply don't bother to analyze crime statistics, I don't bother to read the academic criminology literature on migration and crime, if I don't bother to learn what's really going on, but instead simply report the gory details of every crime that I can find committed by an undocumented migrant in breathless detail, then I'm a bullshitter. I'm indifferent to the larger truth about whether undocumented migrants are actually a violent threat any more than anybody else is. And at the same time, I don't necessarily get the facts wrong, right? Maybe all those gory details that I've cherry-picked are factually accurate, but what's more important is that I'm deploying those facts in the service of a bullshit mission. Frankfurt argues that we're seeing a proliferation of bullshit in the world today. He partially blames postmodernism for this in a kind of a coded jab aimed at other philosophers, but that's actually kind of a topic for another course, really. What's more relevant to us right now for the moment is his other explanation for the rise of bullshit. Quote, "Bullshit is unavoidable whenever circumstances require someone to talk without knowing what he is talking about. Thus, the production of bullshit is stimulated whenever a person's obligations or opportunities to speak about some topic are more excessive than his knowledge of the facts that are relevant to that topic." This discrepancy is common in public life, where people are frequently impelled, whether by their own propensities or by the demands of others, to speak extensively about matters of which they are to some degree ignorant. Closely related instances arise from the widespread conviction that it is the responsibility of a citizen in a democracy to have opinions about everything, or at least everything that pertains to the conduct of his country's affairs. The lack of any significant connection between a person's opinions and his apprehension of reality will be even more severe, needless to say, for someone who believes it is his responsibility as a conscientious moral agent to evaluate events and conditions in all parts of the world. I want to put a pin in this point that bullshit might be related to the cultural obligations imposed on citizens, and it might also be related to the fact that the world is complex and getting more so every day, and that people are being asked to have opinions about stuff that they can't possibly understand. That's something we're going to discuss later, actually. Jacques Ellul, in his book on propaganda, is going to argue that the growing obligation to at least feign knowledge about the complexities of the world is a key driver on the demand side, the consumer side, for propaganda. But so a big part of bullshit is indifference to the truth. But another big part, actually, which it shares with lying, is the intent to deceive. The producer of bullshit doesn't want the consumer to understand their game. And that, for Frankfurt, in Frankfurt's terminology, that's what differentiates bullshit from what he calls a bull session. By a bull session, he means a social gathering in which people get together with the shared understanding that they shouldn't take one another's statements too seriously. Getting together to shoot the shit, in other words. Here's how Frankfurt explains the attitude of the bull session participant in contrast to the bullshit producer or the bullshit consumer. Quote, each of the contributors to a bull session relies, in other words, upon a general recognition that what he expresses or says is not to be understood as being what he means wholeheartedly or believes unequivocally to be true. The purpose of the conversation is not to communicate beliefs. Accordingly, the usual assumptions about the connection between what people say and what they believe are also suspended. The statements made in a bull session differ from bullshit in that there's no pretense that this connection is being sustained. Frankfurt's point here, which fits in nicely with the discussion in my previous lecture of how people make meaning of representations, is that the status of a claim about the world depends upon the relationship between the speaker and the listener, right? So truth or falsehood are socially produced. A useful additional term we can throw in here is intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is when multiple people, multiple minds, attribute the same meaning to the same object. A bull session is different than bullshit because both the speaker and the listener have an intersubjective understanding that what is said shouldn't be taken seriously. And this is a point that I'm going to return to a few times, especially when I discuss the internet. Clay Shirky, whose book Here Comes Everybody I'm going to discuss in a subsequent lecture, argues that one of the big dangers of online communication is that because it's become so easy to copy and paste, to reproduce and disseminate cultural objects, messages that are originally intended for a closed, intersubjective community often end up reaching a much larger audience who interprets them out of their original social context. In other words, what happens in bull sessions doesn't always stay in bull sessions. Sometimes a statement or an image or whatever escapes into the wider world where its meaning changes dramatically. Maybe something that was originally meant as a joke for insider becomes fake news for outsiders. And then the final term that I want to go over just briefly from Frankfurt is humbug. As I interpret it, humbug is kind of a subset of bullshit, or you could call it maybe a partial bullshit, one that's oriented not so much toward making a claim about what's happening in the world, but rather one that's intended to shape the listener's impression of the speaker. Frankfurt points out that when we try to deceive somebody about the world, we're necessarily engaging in a double, a kind of two-part deception. One deception that's external and one that's internal to us, to the speaker. Right, so first, we, the speaker, are trying to deceive our listener, our audience, about something out there in the world. And whether we label our claim a lie or bullshit depends on whether we know or care about what's actually happening out in the world. But then, second of all, we're also trying to deceive our listener about our own inner state of mind, right? We're trying to get them to think that we think something is true. But what humbug is, how Frankfurt defines it, is as a misrepresentation that's oriented principally toward that second, internal deception. When we engage in humbug, we aren't necessarily trying to get our listener to think differently, to believe a claim about the world or anything in the world except for us, ourselves, our own internal state of minds. Humbug is a strategy of deceptive self-presentation, of showing ourselves to be a particular kind of person, a patriot or an intellectual or a friend or whatever. That said, often humbug can be an important part of setting the stage, of kind of priming an audience for a lie or for bullshit, because a big part of how we evaluate claims, and I suppose this falls under coherence as a criteria for evaluating truthfulness, a big part of how we evaluate claims about the world is by sizing up the speaker, right? Do they seem honest? Do they seem like they're on my side? And so signaling authenticity, signaling reliability, maybe signaling empathy or kinship with the listener, also maybe signaling scientific authority through humbug, can be an important way to lay the groundwork for deception in the form of claims about the rest of the world. So that's an important factor to consider whenever you're looking at a case of false news or propaganda or whatever. Don't just look at the claims being made. Also look at the producer of those claims, at how the producer of false claims is presenting themselves, and consider why their humbug might be convincing to a particular audience. Okay, that's all for Harry Frankfurt on bullshit. Next up is Hannah Arendt on truth in politics. Thanks for watching, and please stick around for the final installment of this lecture.